Welcome to the State of the Nation weekly update. The big news of the week by far has been the outcome of the American elections, which turned out to surprise pundits and pollsters alike, as Donald Trump won in a landslide over Kamala Harris, and certainly one of the most uncertain outcomes was made very certain with the announcement of those results. And this has to be covered in the weekly update because it has massive implications. So I have a great guest joining me today to help us make sense of what happened in those American elections, and that is Dr. Frans Cronje. Frans, welcome back to the State of the Nation.
Mike, nice to be back.
Now, Frans, it was just a couple of weeks ago that we sat together, and you were the one analyst that had factored in a Trump win. Everybody else was sitting on the fence, but people heard you first on the State of the Nation calling a win for Trump in this election.
It was obvious Mr. Trump was going to win. I have a colleague who must get some of the credit, or a lot of it. Gabriel Macon is a young analyst, works for the Social Research Foundation, which is actually a South African polling group. And Gabriel had been collecting a lot of polling data on America going back several months. And he developed a very interesting methodology where he took averages of that data and applied it to the American Electoral College results. And in every report Gabriel produced for us, Mr. Trump won by a significant margin. And in order to address the extent to which we were certain that would be the case, Gabriel changed his methodology towards the end. And what he did is, if there was a state that Mr. Trump won by less than the margin of error of the polls, he awarded that state to Kamala Harris. And even under that methodology, so Mr. Trump only being awarded Electoral College votes where he won by more than the margin of error on the polls in a particular state, he was still winning the election every time that this was done. And Gabriel wrote a note in which he said it's the foundation's call that Trump will win the elections. I don't agree that this was a close run race. I don't agree that the polls missed it. They might have been a bit off on the absolute vote count in America. But if you did the more important thing and used the polls to calculate the Electoral College result, you got a number very much along the lines of what we saw recorded in America yesterday.
What was noticeable, of course, was also how, relative to what seemed like quite a messy process in the 2020 elections, clearly the electoral authorities in the various states in America seem to have got their act together, and there's been no question about the processes used. So, following the disputed outcomes in 2020, where there was a whole heap of problems with voting, obviously not helped by COVID at that point, but it did seem to be a very slick process.
But look, it was also very definitive, the process. In only 2 states did the Republicans not see their performance improve relative to that of the previous election. And outside of the West Coast and Colorado, New Mexico, and the Northeast, Kamala Harris didn't win anything, essentially. So the result was so overwhelmingly in Mr. Trump's favor that the need for any recounts or anything that might delay the process just didn't factor in.
Frans, despite what people say, America remains probably the most important country in the world. And this is quite a seismic change politically, especially since Donald Trump came into politics. It seemed to have had the effect of driving the Democrats further to one side of the aisle and the Republicans further to the other side of the aisle. And we're now going to see quite a big change in policy. Now, when you were with us, you explained that this may actually work in South Africa's favor because the Trump presidency may better understand South Africa's strategic importance in geopolitics, because we secure one very important leg of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, just very briefly, if you missed that one, think of a triangle, and the first point in the triangle is the Solomon Islands. That's a little way off the Australian east coast. And if you draw a line from the Solomon Islands to the gateway of the Suez Canal at Djibouti, there's that's an important naval point. Then draw a line down from Djibouti to Simonstown on the southern tip, and draw that line back to the Solomon Islands. You get a triangle. That triangle commands the South Pacific, the whole of the Indian Ocean rim, the access point to the Suez Canal out of the Indian Ocean. And it's the gateway to the South Atlantic, which has been historically a terribly important geostrategic terrain. Now, the Solomon Island point of the triangle, China's made significant diplomatic gains in developing a foothold there. China now has a naval facility at Djibouti, which rivals that or challenges the previous dominance that Western countries had of the access point to that gateway. In the middle of the triangle, what's called the unsinkable aircraft carrier is Diego Garcia, an American naval facility leased from the UK that the UK, Keir Starmer, recently gave back to Mauritius, and it's likely now to find it's become increasingly China sympathetic. And the final point in that triangle, to have utter dominance from the South Pacific to the South Atlantic, is Simonstown. And I think this is increasingly well understood by security thinkers in the West. And South Africa is therefore seen as strategically very important. And for the world's leading liberal democracies, and America is absolutely one of those. And this result showed that more than it detracted from it. It's the sense is that for that southern point, that South Atlantic gateway, to remain friendly to Western liberal democracy, South Africa needs to be a very successful, high-growth liberal democracy itself. And so I've read a lot about how bad this is for Africa. Mr. Trump's win for South Africa, it's virtually the end, you know. I completely disagree with that. I think it's as misguided as people who thought this was a close race, let alone a race that Trump could lose. And I think that if South Africa positions itself correctly, which really means stop threatening U.S. national security interests, then I think the relationship between South Africa and the U.S. could improve greatly under this Trump administration relative to what we've seen for much of the past decade.
Now, Frans, how does that dovetail with a lot of the Trump rhetoric of isolationism, you know, looking inward as opposed to looking outward? Do you think that was just vote-catching stuff, or, you know, because this is almost at odds with a lot of what he was saying, where, you know, it seems like a real American first type of campaign that he ran?
Right. If you believe this was a close race and no one knew who was going to win, you've also read that America is now going to build Fortress America. It's going to rocket tariff rates up, slam world trade, shut out emerging markets. You'll read all of that. For many of the people who hold that view, one of the questions I put to them is, do you know what average American tariff levels are on imports? And are those tariff levels higher than the global average, or lower than the global average, or the same as the global average? Very often the people don't know because they go along with these easy narratives without thinking. American tariff levels on American imports are very much lower than the global average. And there are people in America, and some of them around the Trump administration, who think that that's unfair on America and it gives its trade partners an advantage they don't deserve. One of the consequences of that advantage is that manufacturing employment in America is sharply down over a number of years. And as I read some of the policy stuff of the Trump team, I don't agree with all of it. But on something like that, if they were to put it to you that it's unfair to America that our import tariffs have to be so much lower than the average for the rest of the world, we want to hike them to parity, that would seem perfectly reasonable to me. And if you were a supporter of free trade, which in most respects I probably am, you might say, well, shouldn't we be saying this the other way around, that the rest of the world should be dropping their tariff rates if you want a free trade society. What you see in this point, the point about that Trump would win, is that a very small circle of graduate school educated liberal elites around the Western world have a disproportionate influence on the ideas and the news flow that people hear. And that manipulates and distorts their understanding of reality to a point where what they understand is at odds with that reality. And the importance, I think, of news platforms such as yours. Now, Jeff Bezos just wrote that in an opinion piece in America about his newspaper, saying it had lost all credibility, and that credibility was being eroded by podcasts. That's absolutely correct, because very often podcasts that aren't controlled by these grad school educated, very wealthy elites have been able to generally around the world, it's true in South Africa too, provide better and more balanced news reporting, fact-based reporting, than traditional mainstream media that have sought to drive ideological agendas and preach to their readers in order to shape the outcome of events, as opposed to try and educate them about events.
Yeah, well, we certainly, many of the people that watch the State of the Nation will know the value of that. Frans, I want to touch on, in terms of some of Trump's announcements, and that was around the global conflicts. Obviously, what's gone on in the Middle East has been massively divisive in the world. There was the attack October the 7th, followed by a big response, followed by, escalation. Ukraine and Russia has been at it now for 2.5 years. And Trump promises to bring an end to those. What do you think? What do you see as a strategy there that Trump may follow?
I think Mr. Trump will make the world a much safer place. The first thing you're likely to see, I'll say you will see, is that the war in Europe will end early on in Mr. Trump's term. And what will happen is the two sides will come to an agreement, probably broadly along the lines of the old Minsk Accords, which is where this conflict should have been settled all along, possibly a few land swaps, and Europe will calm completely. There were some very sensible proposals before this terrible and horrible war with this massive slaughter of young people was allowed to happen. And we'll fall back onto those agreements now. The war in Europe will end. In the Middle East, what will happen? Yep.
No, because obviously the war in Europe, you talk about the slaughter of young people that neither side can afford, with low birth rates and a dearth of young people. So both Putin and Zelensky are looking for a way out. There can be no doubt to that.
Yeah, look, Russia can hold out for longer. It's not my view, but hardline Russians say Ukraine will run out of Poles before Russia runs out of Russians. And that's the unfortunate, horrible and bloody reality of it. And my sense is that the Russians would long have wished for a settlement, and they did not wish for this conflict to occur in the first place at all. And to a very great extent, when the history of this is written, I think that NATO aggression and the threat that NATO posed to Crimea and the expansion beyond the early guarantees eastward must be read as one of the key contributing factors to this conflict. So I've held throughout a slightly different view on what has happened in this war to what has been, again, that mainstream view articulated by traditional Western media in the hands of these very wealthy elites. And as I've said, I think the damage they do by forcing a view upon the world, a cocoon, as it were, that's often at odds with reality. So that war in Europe will end. In the Middle East, the Iranians will be reined in, both financially and in terms of oil. They will no longer have the resources to sponsor the proxy parties, which were the triggers that detonated the conflicts now in Lebanon and in Gaza as well, and of course Yemen with the Houthis, and there's a bit going on in Syria and Iraq as well. And so those conflicts will be dialed down completely. I think in Lebanon, you'll see Hezbollah pull back from that front, and that will cool. And in Gaza, the focus will shift to the destruction and the rebuilding, and a question of how that territory will now be governed. So I think Trump makes the world a safer place. In some respects, in theory, that brings about risk-on sentiment to the world. Except in this case, I wouldn't overstate that, because I think that markets and the like have become so familiar and even comfortable around these conflicts that as drivers of risk-off sentiment, they aren't as pronounced as some people might think they are. So number one, the world becomes a safer place. Second thing that's going to happen under Mr. Trump is you're going to see a bit of strength in the dollar. Mr. Trump's efforts on energy policy, for example, and if they need to hammer Iranian oil exports, will see dollars flow back to America. The tariff measures that may be threatened, possibly introduced, will also tend to see dollars flow back to America. That's dollar strength, dollar index strength. The American stock market has responded very positively to Mr. Trump because it thinks it dodges some of the tax and other counterproductive policies that might have come out of a Harris administration. That's, again, dollars to America, dollar index strengthens. Mr. Trump's also going to add to the American deficit, most likely. And some of his tariff measures, although they have an interesting argument about those, should also be at least mildly inflationary. That means interest rates in America and perhaps across much of the Western world hold higher for longer. And as a consequence, again, dollars to America. So the market does well. The dollar strengthens, but I think you're also going to see gold and crypto strengthening at the same time. That's an interesting phenomenon of trends. And the reason is, on the longer, sort of 2-3 year trajectory of the Trump administration, there is concern that his policies could be mildly inflationary. And you'll start to see gold lift and you'll see crypto lift, most likely because of the hedge that you take complete advantage of the market now under Mr. Trump, as you would already have if you'd listened to sensible advice in that election. But into the longer term, gold and crypto as inflation hedges, we'll probably see them lift as well. So between making the world a safer place and making the dollar somewhat stronger, these are the two key effects that the Trump administration are going to have on the lived experience of hundreds of millions of people around the world.
Now, when one talks about billions of people, you can't talk about Donald Trump without mentioning China, because he was the first person that called out China on many of Chinese practices, copyright infringement and theft, trade espionage, those kind of things. And just when he was ramping up his rhetoric and action against China, along came COVID, and I presume Donald Trump will always feel that COVID cost him his second term, which he now gets belatedly. But what he started against in his sort of efforts, on China, were doubled down in many cases by Biden. It seemed to be the one thing that they were in line with. What happens with American and Chinese relationships?
Look, inciting a riot at the Capitol didn't help Mr. Trump's election chances at the end of COVID either. So,
that followed the election.
Yeah, well, yeah. But on both counts, that kind of rhetoric poisoned opinion in America against him to a sufficient extent at the tail end of COVID that he lost. It wasn't entirely out of his hands. Had he listened, there were some very good people, I'm led to believe, in his administration who told him exactly how he was going to lose the election. One was the alienated woman, and he ignored a lot of that advice, as he would sometimes want.
There's a lot of that going around.
There is. Now there is the question of China. I think the China, look, one first thing, very long game diplomacy. I've been so interested in this triangle around the Indian Ocean, and Solomon Islands, such a key part of that. Chinese diplomats have been active for 30 years in positioning themselves on the Solomon Islands. Chinese read on Donald Trump is going to be this is a hardliner. He's to be taken seriously. He might be a bit crazy, and so don't tempt him. Let this term of his play out before attempting anything dramatic, such as the blockade of Taiwan, which will preempt its return into under China Beijing control, and which very few people think about Australia being cut off from the protection of Hawaii. I think the Chinese will be discretion will be the better part of valor through the era of Mr. Trump.
Now, Frans, there've been many sort of things, attributed to Donald Trump, and one is his admiration for strong men. And his perceived cozy relationships with people like Vladimir Putin, even little rocket man down in North Korea. What do you think happens with those relationships? Do you see Donald Trump as being somebody that's going to tolerate the strongman situation? Do you think he will weaken those strong men? It is an issue because those are very much the people disturbing the peace in many ways.
Well, not necessarily entirely. The rocket man is very much kept in check by China, and they, it's their stomping ground that. And Mr. Putin will settle this conflict. I think there's been a willingness to do that on Russia's side for a long time. And also, if you're a Western strategist, do you wish to weaken Mr. Putin? And in that case, what happens? Does Russia fall into the arms of China as a Chinese proxy? There's some more, I'd suggest from a Western perspective, shrewder security thinkers who say that Russia should be cultivated as a bulwark against Chinese expansion towards Europe. So I don't go along really to begin with this idea of admiring the strong. Perhaps he does, perhaps he doesn't. I don't know. But what he does, I think, or what his predecessors perhaps didn't, let's put it that way, is had a proper appreciation of the importance of deterrence through power. That can be economic power, can be military power. Deterrence as an underpinning of diplomacy. Because the world is not the end of history environment that a lot of Western liberal thinkers had believed it was when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed. And many of them believed that collapse was the final victory of the liberal democratic order, and that liberal democracy would spread around the world. And that if it did, the need to bring hard power forward to underpin diplomacy would fall away, and you could very simply just be nice. And that was an analytical mistake. The end of history did not happen. The last threats to the liberal Western order did not collapse. They exist. They exist in Russia. They exist in China. They exist in North Korea. They exist particularly in Iran. And I think what's understood in the administration that Mr. Trump first brought to power, and probably the one he will bring to power again, is that the Western liberal order needs to toughen up if it wishes to see off the threats to its survival. And I would rather interpret his approach to the use of power and how to deal with strong, powerful political leaders, threats to the West in those terms, than in the terms used again by that mainstream Western liberal media that is kowtowing to the little rocket man. I think you can interpret the behavior differently and in a manner that is to the advantage of the West, of the broader Western liberal democratic order.
Frans, I just want to touch on two things before we go. One is BRICS. Nobody has led the charge against Western hegemony, as they call it, faster than BRICS, with little South Africa yapping on and, doing everything in their power to try and make that fantasy a reality. What do you think happens to BRICS? Because it really has got its tail up.
Well, it's got its tail up, partly because the West is on retreat. And the West is on retreat because of this end of history delusion that you no longer need to use hard power, or even that it would be wrong to use hard power, even that it would be morally objectionable for Western democracies to use their hard power, their military and economic power to enforce their values and belief systems where they regard those as being threatened. And that has allowed adversaries of the Western world to advance. I think a greater parity will be brought to bear as a consequence of the Trump election for the reason that I've mentioned. But the BRICS grouping is going to be increasingly influential in the world. And what it really is if you were at the end of history period, you thought was now a unipolar world of the Western liberal order, what the BRICS grouping firmly establishes is that this is a multipolar world, and it is unlikely that we will return ever to that unipolar order dominated by the Western liberal democracies. And the challenge is that for South Africa, go back to that again, is how does South Africa play out its foreign policy in this environment? And I think the correct way to do it would be to learn a lot from perhaps what India does, where we don't take a partisan stance one way or the other. I think the Democratic Alliance takes a very partisan stance. It's pro-Ukraine. It doesn't always ask the question of whether Ukrainian opposition is the equivalence of the DA. They wouldn't like the answer. But and the ANC sometimes takes a very firmly pro-Russia stance, even though I do think that some of the ANC's analysis on the war in Europe is correct. Instead of that, let's take a South Africa, its interests are primary stance, realize we're 0.5 percentage point of global GDP, and much of our success as a country will be determined by the extent that we can leverage our geostrategic position, the corner of that little triangle, in order to win trade and other concessions from the world's great powers. And I think with some shrewdness back in foreign affairs, which there isn't, some top-class people sitting in South Africa's embassies around the world, we can play this multipolar world off one power block against another in a manner that advantages South Africans back at home.
And then lastly, we started off by talking about South Africa's strategic importance and why this might play into our favor. But under a Trump administration, how does it affect South Africa directly? We're sitting with the AGOA agreement, which admittedly in the first Trump administration, he made no moves to end. But we are a couple of years down the line. South Africa is now sitting with a government of national unity. So, factoring in the strategic importance and the fact that the Trump administration may be more alive to that, do you think this is a good or a bad outcome for South Africa?
I think it's a good outcome. There's AGOA thing's overblown. You mustn't tell anyone, but AGOA is not that important to South African exports. It's a tiny fraction of the whole. A lot of that sits in the auto industry, which is a net negative to the South African economy, given what it does to the price of used vehicles and how that keeps poor people in poverty. And the sort of moral side of it, could be picked up by any other buyers, and I'm just generally American exports and the like. Far more important is the effort in Congress to have the administration report whether South Africa is threatening U.S. national security interests, and it's worded in exactly those terms. It's almost a verbatim quote. That must be watched, I think, more than the question of AGOA itself. And the concern, as I detected, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. The concern in America with South Africa is chiefly that South Africa trades its foreign policy and its lost of its admittedly burnished credibility from the democratic transition years. It trades that to provide influence on global fora to countries and regions that threaten the Western liberal order. And rightly, that upsets a lot of well-informed people in America who see it as a threat to their future. Remove that threat. Don't front the global strategies of the West adversaries. Hence my advice on not neutral on human rights questions necessarily, but a much more sort of impartial foreign policy. And I think the heat that was turned up in Congress on South Africa will be turned down again. And then it's up to the South Africans, It's very easy. You've read that from the South African press over the last 24 hours. How terrible Trump is for South Africa. How this is sort of the end of the South African economy. Nonsense. A bit of introspection on the South African side will do them a lot of good. It's not America that caused South Africa's unemployment rate to be 35%. It's not America that causes 6 in 100 children to pass maths in South Africa with a grade of 50% or higher. America doesn't export the violence that puts South Africa's murder rate at a level of over 30 per 100,000, which is astronomical by global standards. The potholes, the incompetence, the corruption in government, the wastage, the looting. This isn't caused by Mr. Trump and his as one, we've screwed that up. But before he was elected, someone said to me, an American, the best thing your country could do would be to make sure that Congress does not know that it exists. Now, we failed at that rather spectacularly. And in fact, in the last year, South Africa in Congress was perhaps one of very few, perhaps the only thing that united the bipartisan divide in America. That's the extent to which South Africa threatened U.S. national security interests. Stop that, do a little bit of introspection, realize that there are a lot of decisions that can be taken within the country that will raise its its economic competitiveness, trade that against its strategic importance, and South Africa can do very well from developing sound and productive relations with the United States as much as with Russia, China, and all the rest of them. But they're not going to do it for us, because the reason we're down and out has very little to do with them.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We needed to know what the election of Donald Trump means to South Africa and the world, and we have one of the best in the world here, Dr. Frans Cronje, explaining it to us. So I'd like to thank Pace Car Rental for keeping State of the Nation on the air, and thank Frans Cronje for joining us today. To everybody that's enjoyed this program, I hope you're a subscriber, and we'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you all.